Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive. As usual, we got a great show for you today. And this one may be even more unique than some of the others because obviously I'm coming to you live from Washington, D.C. But now we have coming to you also live from the opposite side of the country. We've got it bracketed in live from Los Angeles, California. We have David Sachs. David Sachs is an entrepreneur. He's a software investor and co-host of the All In podcast. Welcome to the show, David.
Yeah, good to be here.
I wonder what is a software investor? What does that mean? And can you tell us a little bit about what you do, even?
Yeah, so I'm a venture capitalist or VC, and we write checks at the earliest stage of company formation. We basically invest in founders who just have a good idea. I mean, these are people who don't have any money, connections, power, any of those types of things. They're just somebody who has a good idea, and we go looking for those things, and we write a check knowing that probably 9 times out of 10 it's going to be a zero, but you hope on the 10th that it's going to be a big outcome.
Wow, that's so it's kind of like the Shark Tank sort of thing.
A little bit, yeah, a little bit. So I do that for just software businesses, internet related stuff, and I've been doing internet investing and founding companies in the internet space for over 20 years, since PayPal in 1999.
And so how did you get into the All In podcast there? And kind of, is that just talking about, or did it start off, I guess, just talking about software issues also, or because obviously it's kind of evolved into some other things now?
Yeah. So the All In Pod is a podcast that I do on a weekly basis with 3 other co-hosts who are all themselves entrepreneurs or investors in Silicon Valley. We started doing it during COVID. I think the first month of COVID, we just kind of got together. We were all kind of locked in our houses at that point. So we got on Zoom and we recorded a pod. And so in those early days, COVID and what was happening with the larger issue there was one of the main topics. But it grew, and so at this point, it's a weekly show where we discuss current events, and it can be business, markets, but we'll also cover politics, geopolitics, whatever is the top story in the news. We'll lean into that.
And I see, and you're also expand your empire a little bit because I saw yesterday actually you invited me onto your Twitter space. I think they call it X Spaces now. On a pretty important topic, and you had Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy on there, and a number of other eminent speakers, and so talking about the issue of, are we heading to World War III? And Elon on there seemed to be pretty seriously concerned about some of that. And I just wonder how that came about too. That whole podcast. I mean, that whole episode.
Well, yeah, Elon said that he felt like we were sleepwalking into World War III, and we should come back and talk about that. But in terms of how this happened, I've done a few of these with Elon now. Elon's been a friend since PayPal days, going back over 20 years.
Oh, wow.
And when he took over Twitter, now X, I kind of just helped out as a volunteer during the transition. And we started doing some of these X spaces with political candidates. And in this particular case, Vivek Ramaswamy had the idea, and he's been one of the only candidates out there talking about the fact that, that we're pursuing this very risky foreign policy, and maybe we should be, thinking harder about what we're doing. So we set up a room, it was me, Elon, and Vivek, and then I asked you to participate because I've really enjoyed and appreciated your commentary, both during this Israel-Gaza situation and during the Ukraine war. And then we also invited Alexander Mercouris from the Duran and a couple other folks whose commentary on this issue I thought been insightful. So yeah, that's how the room came about.
I see. Did not know that about your history with Elon Musk. It's pretty interesting there. So, but yeah, let's talk about that issue there specifically because it is really important about the possibility of escalating into World War III. Now, I think a lot of people are thinking that's you're kind of overblowing. It's a lot of hyperbole. It's not that serious. But I think when you examine the underlying conditions and the circumstances that are starting to boil up really across the board, I think it becomes a lot more serious. Yesterday, I think that probably the one of the potential trigger points for a lot of this is going to come in what's happening in Israel right now and what's about to probably happen. Yesterday, the Minister of Defense of Israel was talking to some of his troops and giving a little bit of a foretaste of what we might can expect.
המשיכו להיערך להתקפה כי היא תגיע. אנחנו נערכים ביסודיות, זאת תהיה התקפה קטלנית, זאת תהיה התקפה משולבת מהיבשה, מהים ומהאוויר. עשו את העבודה שלכם, תתכוננו, אנחנו נפעיל אתכם.
Now, we're already having lots of people saying, yeah, and if Hezbollah makes good on its threat, that if Israel goes into the Gaza Strip, then Hezbollah is going to come in to open up a new northern front against Israel. And a lot of Americans are saying if that happens, then we need to get involved, led by the ever hawkish Lindsey Graham.
Iran, if you escalate this war, we're coming for you.
Are you effectively poised to declare war on Iran? That's very strong language.
I am poised to use military force to destroy the source of funding for Hamas and Hezbollah.
And what really bothers me is that he's got a long history of this, but he doesn't actually think about what comes next or what the results of this. But fortunately, others like Elon have been thinking about it. And Elon's not the only one. Actually, Doug McGregor yesterday was even more concerned when he said this on Tucker.
Do you think that we are moving toward war with Iran?
Yes, I do. And it looks like the chosen destination is indeed Armageddon. There doesn't seem to be any real appreciation for the implications for us and frankly, for Europe and the world, as well as the Middle East, of such action. You know, take for an example, just on the economic side, about 20% of the world's oil passes through the Straits of Hormuz every month, probably 25% of liquefied natural gas. And you're talking about shutting down 2 to 3 million barrels a day of oil from Iran. The bottom line is that we need to think this through, and everyone right now is emoting. There is no thinking anywhere, as far as I can tell. The only possible exception may be, amazingly enough, Mr. Erdogan in Turkey, who came out this morning and indicated he was willing to mediate.
So what do you think, David, is the reason why there's at least a lot of people aren't giving much serious consideration to this and want to seem to just reflexively say, we'll be with Israel, and if anybody attacks Israel, we're going to go and attack them without thinking about these things through? And do you think that it is overblown?
Well, neocons like Lindsey Graham have always wanted to get into a war with Iran. I mean, if you go all the way back to the plan before the Iraq war in 2003, the idea was not just to do Iraq. They thought that was going to be the first of a number of dominoes to fall. And their claim was that we're going to be so successful in Iraq, we're going to be greeted as liberators, that the rest of the Middle East is just going to throw up their arms and they're going to convert to becoming democracies. Obviously, it didn't work out that way, but they've never given up the dream of basically going into all these countries and knocking off all these regimes. So I think that this braying for war with Iran is something that has never really stopped. It's something that has always been on their agenda. And the concern is now they may have the perfect excuse to start it.
Well, yeah, that's my worry too, because if Hezbollah does come in, and I think that there's probably a pretty good chance that does happen. The real question is what the United States is going to do. And of course, as I think I argued yesterday on your Twitter space there, we should not get involved with that. Israel can handle it. But a lot of people are actually, I think, like you're saying, wanting to have that opportunity to go in. I guess the question is, what do you think the Biden administration is going to do? Because Lindsey Graham and a lot of other people can say what they want all day long, but what matters is what the president's going to do. And do you have any insight into maybe what his thinking might be?
Well, I would see it in terms of scenarios. I mean, it's something we sometimes do in business is we kind of lay out a few different scenarios. I think there's basically 3 scenarios here. So scenario number 1 is basically the scenario that the Biden administration and let's call it the Israeli government are kind of laying out for us, which is Israel's going to go into Gaza with a ground invasion, like combined with, air and sea, like you saw, that the administration's threats will effectively deter Hezbollah or other actors from getting into the war, and that Israel will achieve its objective of kind of rooting out Hamas and we'll kind of go and they'll create new conditions in the Middle East. That's sort of their claim. I think there's really good reasons to be skeptical of that. So that kind of brings us to scenario number 2, and this Alexander Mercouris kind of laid this out on the show that we did, where Israel goes in. The ground operation is much more difficult than expected. It's guerrilla fighting. You've spoken to this, I think, very articulately. They're going to be facing ambushes, snipers, anti-tank weapons, this sort of tunnel network. When they went in 2008 and 2014, it was certainly less than decisive. So they start getting bogged down in that, and they start taking more casualties than the Israeli public over time is willing to stand for.
Yep.
At the same time, you start seeing a lot of pressure build on the Arab street. Even I think in Western countries, there's going to be increasing protests and maybe riots. You'll start to see a diplomatic initiative really take shape. There'll be a united Arab front on this. China and Russia have already said where they stand, which is, in favor of this diplomatic solution. So there'll be pressure building everywhere for Israel to stop, maybe even in Israeli society as they take casualties. And since Iran doesn't want a wider regional war, this was the scenario that Alexander laid out. We basically, after some period of time, get to a ceasefire, and we were able to avoid a larger regional war. So that would be scenario number 2, which is just kind of this inconclusive, indecisive version of it. And I guess Alexander felt like that was probably the most likely scenario, but I don't know that you can assign probabilities to it.
Yeah.
Then you get to kind of scenario number 3, which is some of the things that you're talking about and what McGregor's talking about, where as Israel goes in, and I think we'll see a lot of the conditions that you talked about, they start taking more of these casualties. They're going to have to bring in more air support, more artillery in order to, basically more firepower, in order to avoid huge casualties on their side. The reaction to that will be, uprising. It won't just be, like a one night of protests like we saw with the situation with that hospital bombing in Gaza, where basically the whole Arab street erupted all over the world. That would just be a small taste of what we'll see. You'll start seeing uprisings in the West Bank. And at some point, Hezbollah feels enough pressure that they just have to do something. They can't just sit back and do nothing while Gaza is being destroyed. And so they do enter the war. And the Biden administration's threats, just simply cannot deter Hezbollah, not because they want a wider regional war, but just because they feel like their credibility is on the line. And if they don't get involved, they'll just appear to be completely feckless. And moreover, they can't really take the risk of their key ally Hamas being destroyed, and then they will face the full brunt of the IDF. So they get involved. And then, Iran can't stand the possibility of losing their key regional ally. And so they have to support Hezbollah in whatever way they can. And now, Israel will face a 2 or maybe even 3 front war, depending on what's happening on the West Bank. And, the United States can't stand the idea of an existential threat to Israel. So now it feels forced to get involved. And now all of a sudden we're in a wider regional war. And, again, you start seeing this chain reaction, and where it goes is really hard to know.
Yeah. And what I think to your point there a second ago about some of the uprisings and the anger on the Arab street. I mean, we're already seeing just in London a couple of days ago, there was 100,000 people that were protesting there. And that's just where it's at so far. That's before Israel has gone in. But when you continue to see these images of Israeli airstrikes going in and just destroying entire buildings, there was a bunch of those. There was some of those have been shown earlier today. I was on NBC News a little bit while ago, and a whole new set of them, 400, I think, were in the last 24 hours. And it's just methodically destroying the city of Gaza. And again, we haven't even gone in yet. So once the people go, the Israeli Defense Forces actually go in there, and we're already at about 5,000 civilian casualties inside the strip, and at least 2,000 of those are children, with another 800 missing. And I'm starting to be concerned that even before the IDF goes in there, is there going to be, a burgeoning anger among the Arab street, and whether that's with Hezbollah or some of these other groups, that it's going to prompt them to act, even if they didn't want to, even if they fear that they can't, go against the combined might of the Israeli and U.S. forces, but that they might do it anyway.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that one of the contradictions here, or dilemmas, I think, for Israel is that it's hard to see how they can achieve their military objectives without there being growing civilian casualties. And the more civilian casualties that they create, the more they turn world opinion against them. And you already see a lot of this on social media in Western countries. It's not just the stupid, unserious college students who, are chanting from the river to the sea and, using all this like woke decolonizer, rhetoric. I don't really take those people too seriously, but I think you are seeing increasing genuine sympathy in the West from people who do believe in Israel's right to exist, but at the same time are concerned about these mounting civilian casualties. And then, of course, like you said, you've got Arab countries who, are already virtually up in arms about what's happening. And so that anger is just going to build. And, I think, and so that creates tremendous pressure on the leaders of all these countries to do something. So even if they'd rather not get involved, they have to think about their own political situation and holding on to their own thrones. And the way to do that might be to take a stronger stance against Israel. So everybody here is being buffeted by pressures that come from below, and that, as well as above. And so that's how things cascade out of control here.
And there's actually we said that maybe the most proximal point is if Hezbollah gets involved, but there's actually additional pressure points that could throw this thing into a complete turmoil, and that is the vulnerability of U.S. troops on the ground in Syria and Iraq. And as we've talked about in some of our previous episodes, that's really an annoying thing to me. It's been angering me for years because they don't serve any purpose that defends American national interests, but they're basically a point of vulnerability. Now, our Secretary of Defense, Austin, recognized that a couple of days ago, said this.
Concerned about potential escalation. In fact, what we're seeing is the prospect of a significant escalation of attacks on our troops and our people throughout the region. And because of that, we're going to do what's necessary to make sure that our troops are in the right, good position. They're protected, and that we have the ability to respond.
See, nobody seems to be catching the irony of the fact that the U.S. troops are on the ground and need to be protected. I mean, we're supposed to exist to protect our interest and our people. And now then, because they're just vulnerable out there, we have to protect them. And so far, we've been lucky. There's been a number of attacks. There were several more again today. And so far, none of them have caused casualties. But you can imagine it won't take much at all for one of those attacks to get through and succeed by any number of these jihadi groups. Or even if some of these regimes are, maybe turn a blind eye because somebody else can take care of this, that will help the Palestinian people. And if that happens and an American is killed, there's going to be a lot of pressure from the whole Lindsey Graham wing and a bunch of other people to say, all right, Biden, you got to do something. You got to strike back because it was definitely Iran. And that could spark things out.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, you're right. We got all these bases throughout the Middle East, and they're vulnerable to, again, if you have a movement where you have a rising up of huge numbers of people who are upset and enraged by what's happening in Gaza, these bases could be overrun. Whether it's Iran or not. Now, Iran, I guess, has a faction of Hezbollah in Iraq. They have another proxy in Yemen, the Houthis, who I think just staged an attack on the USS Carney. Maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah.
But which was pretty amazing. So there, like you said, there's some foreshadowing here of what could happen. And everybody, all these actors, I think nobody wants to be in a larger regional war except maybe the neocons. But you're right that you have this pressure that can build up from the population of all these countries. The people of Israel demand that their government go into Gaza and seek retribution for what happened on October 7th. You have the people of the Arab Street of all these different countries are becoming more inflamed and enraged by the civilian casualties as Israel does go into Gaza. You've got, and Hezbollah feels the same way. And then you've got Iran feels the need to support its proxies and allies in the Middle East. And then, like you said, if we get attacked, all of a sudden the American people could be saying, well, let's go get whoever did that. And you know who they're going to blame? no matter who did it, is
No
Iran.
matter, right.
So this whole thing is a powder keg, and it just takes a match to set it off. I mean, this is fundamentally the problem with the scenario number one that I laid out, is that, the idea of this going perfectly according to plan just seems unrealistic given, what a tinderbox the Middle East is. You know the saying about the best laid plans. And so it just feels like it's just not going to work out that way. And none of our best laid plans for the Middle East have worked out over the last 2 decades. So what's to make us think it's going to work out perfectly the way that they say?
Yeah, I was looking at some of the comments here that we're getting in from some of our viewers, and one of whom says that, the powerful patriots in this country right now need to step up and steer us towards a bright, abundant, and peaceful future. And they previously were saying that you were right early on in Ukraine. And so I'm kind of wondering what your position is right now. What is America's interest in this powder keg as it exists today before it's blown up anywhere else? What do you think is America's interest, and what can we do to maybe, lower the temperature a bit and move away from the edge?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, with respect to Ukraine, we have to settle that as quickly as possible. I mean, when you add the combination of these two situations, we have an active proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, combined with the situation in the Middle East. It just makes everything much more dangerous because, Russia is involved in Syria. You saw that Putin just ordered Russian fighter jets to patrol the neutral skies over the Black Sea, and they're equipped with these Kimzal hypersonic missiles that could hit our aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean. So you have this combination of factors that just make everything more dangerous. So the first thing we should do is just establish a ceasefire and settle up on this Ukraine war. I mean, we gave the Ukrainians $100 billion last year with the promise that this would allow them to have a successful counteroffensive, and they would push the Russians back out of these, occupied areas, and then they would threaten Crimea, and then the Russians would have to sue for peace. And so this was the commitment that was made by all these politicians. They didn't tell us that this $100 billion was the baseline for a new annual expense or annual appropriation in a new forever war. They said this is a one-time deal to push Russia back. Well, that didn't work at all. I mean, the counteroffensive was an abysmal failure. Even the New York Times had to admit, with the maps they put out, that Ukraine, not only have they not taken territory, on net, they've actually lost territory. So this Ukraine war has been a total failure. Biden is obsessed with this thing, and he wants to keep it going. And you saw, I think he allocated 4 times more money for Ukraine than Israel, and this sort of hybrid appropriation he's got going. So the first thing we should do is just take that off the table. I mean, that war, there is no prospect for Ukrainian success in that war. I think we all can see that now. So that's the first thing we should do, because I think trying to manage 2 of these situations at the same time is beyond the capacity. It's overloading the bandwidth of policymakers in Washington. Is leading to all of these potential chain reactions that can happen. So that's the easy part of this. With respect to the Israel part of it, there is a long history of Israel, of the United States, not letting Israel go as far as it wants to. In 1982, Ronald Reagan called Menachem Begin when the Israelis were bombing Beirut, told him to stop. The famous history of that, where basically, Begin said this is something we feel like we have to do. Reagan stuck to his guns. 20 minutes later, he got a call back from Begin saying, "Okay, we'll stop." And Reagan said, "I didn't realize I had that kind of power to stop this thing," but he did, because the Israelis will listen to the Americans. And in 1973, it was Nixon and Kissinger who told the Israelis to stop when they were decisively beating the Arab countries. And in 56 with Suez, Eisenhower told them to stop. So the U.S. has a lot of leverage here to calm down or temper the Israeli reaction, which is going to be difficult given how united Israeli society is here in seeking retribution. But that historically has been an important American role here.
Well, David, I think you bring up a good point that American interests are not always synonymous with the other side's interests as well. Israel has a very definite interest in how they're going to operate here. Ukraine has a very different interest in there. Ours are not synonymous with either one of those because, Ukraine was attacked, but our national security is not at stake there. Israel was attacked by Hamas. That's true. And they definitely have every right to extract justice and, punishment on those people who did it. But if they go too far, then that could suddenly infect our interests. If
Right.
Ukraine continues to press on in issues there and tries to get all the money perpetually from us, that's going to cause economic problems for us. So we've got to take into consideration our needs. And I think that it's reasonable to say, hey, Israel, I understand that you need to get justice on Hamas, but it can't be at the expense of all these people that could draw others into it. That's bad for you and it's bad for us.
Yeah, we have our own set of interests. We're allies with Israel, and I believe in protecting their right to exist, certainly. But we have a broader set of interests as well. We do not want to get sucked into a broader regional war. You've also raised the point that this invasion of Gaza is not likely to be successful in the way that is being portrayed. I mean, this idea that they're just going to magically, surgically go in and destroy Hamas, but not give rise to massive civilian casualties that then trigger all these other chain reactions. It just doesn't seem very realistic.
Yeah, David, I saw that myself in Afghanistan. We would go in there and ostensibly to take out Taliban members, but then kill a lot of other people in the process. And then, like the surviving family members of all those people who had nothing to do with the Taliban, didn't like them at all, now all of a sudden they're joining them. And it's like, 100-fold what's going on right now, because people who don't even like Hamas in there, when they're seeing their families are killed and their, buildings completely destroyed so they don't even have a home. I mean, why would they stand silently by if Israel then invades? And so Israel could be stirring up the hornet's nest, and that's just bad. But even bigger than that, I think this to the point that you were raising there, you could go in there and theoretically kill all 30,000 members of Hamas, but you have deepened the conditions that led to the rise of Hamas in there. And now that whoever takes over after that still has an even more angry mob, and how is that going to help Israel long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen from our own experience in the Middle East that terrorism is a hydra. You cut off one head and two more grow in its place. For every terrorist you take out, you accidentally drone a wedding party or something. You have some horrible, collateral damage, I guess is the term. And then all those people, their sons, their daughters, their cousins, their parents, they end up becoming radicalized. So you're right that this just seems like an intractable problem that you can't solve with force. But it does seem like Israel's going to try. And I guess the thing I'm not sure about is what negotiations have happened behind the scene. In an ideal world, you'd want the administration, the U.S. administration, to be in contact with its counterparts in Iran, and they would have an agreement. Obviously, wouldn't be something that's public, but maybe they would agree on the parameters of what the Israeli response could be before either side gets involved, something like that, where they would create some space for Israel to do what it feels it needs to do for its own domestic reasons. And so you'd sort of, everyone would kind of understand what everyone else's red lines were. And so you would be careful. You'd allow Israel to engage in some kind of operation that it feels it needs to do, but you don't let them go too far. And you know exactly where those lines are, and you're kind of carefully managing the whole thing.
That's a great point.
That's the kind of diplomacy that you'd ideally want this administration to be engaging in. But I think, as Alexander pointed out, there is none of that diplomacy. This administration doesn't know how to do it. They're not trusted. They're not having behind the scenes conversations. They're not even talking to their adversaries. There is no conversation going on with Russia. There's no conversation going on with Iran. So in that type of situation, it's so easy for this to spiral out of control. It's so easy for someone to miscalculate because nobody can know anybody else's intentions. And so there's so much room for misinterpretation.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest things there. And I see we're just about out of time here, but David, I so appreciate you coming on, and even more so, I appreciate all the efforts you're doing. I mean, you could just focus on business and taking care of yourself and your family, but with all these platforms that you have, and and also with Elon Musk, they're trying to use some of his influence to do something that's actually going to result in peace for our country and for the world, and God willing that will keep us out of war, because that's certainly one of our primary objectives here on Deep Dive. And we're very grateful for you coming today. Thanks for showing up.
Well, Colonel, I appreciate the work that you're doing. And, I discovered you during this whole Ukraine crisis. And what I saw from both your commentary and the articles you wrote is that you were exactly right. You predicted this counteroffensive would be a failure. And so, the way that I figure out who to listen to on issues is to see who has made predictions that have come true. In the investing world, we call this a track record. In the world of international relations, it appears that track record doesn't matter at all. But that's how there's zero accountability when people get things wrong. But I appreciate the work that you did. And, I'm going to try and get some of our fans at All In to watch your show. So
well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, that we'll leave it right there, and look forward to seeing you back again in the future. I'd love to have you back on. And for us at Deep Dive, that's it. And we'll see you on the next episode.